This isn't about Blake Lively. It's not even about Andy Signor. This is about what happens when a Hollywood celebrity decides independent journalists don't deserve First Amendment protections. Subpoenas sent like spam, Google dragged in, one creator singled out and told, "You're not a real journalist." If this stands, any creator can be next, and that should scare everyone. This story did not start with one subpoena, and it did not start with Andy Signor, and it did not even start with Blake Lively filing a lawsuit. This story started the moment independent media became powerful enough to challenge celebrity narratives without permission, and without institutional backing, and without fear, or at least without fear at first, because what we are watching unfold right now is not simply a legal dispute between a movie star and a director. It is a stress test on whether independent journalists, content creators, and digital commentators are allowed to exist outside the control structure of Hollywood public relations and legacy media power brokers. For years, celebrities controlled the narrative through carefully managed interviews, friendly outlets, embargoed stories, and strategic leaks. But that ecosystem broke the moment platforms like YouTube, podcasts, Substack, and social media gave creators direct access to audiences without needing approval from studios, networks, or publicists. And for a long time, Hollywood tolerated it because it seemed messy but harmless. But tolerance ended when those voices started winning trust, when audiences began believing independent reporting more than glossy press tours, and when creators began asking questions that legacy outlets would not ask because access mattered more than truth. And that is the backdrop for everything happening now with Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the unprecedented wave of subpoenas aimed at content creators. This is not chaos, this is strategy. When Blake Lively filed her lawsuit in federal court in New York, she did more than accuse Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer Studios of misconduct. She introduced a second narrative, one that would become just as important as the claims themselves. The idea that negative coverage about her did not arise organically, but was manufactured, amplified, and coordinated through third-party content creators and online commentators. The theory was simple and powerful. If criticism did not come from real people responding to facts, then it must have come from manipulation. And if it came from manipulation, then those who spread it were not journalists, but tools. And once that framing is accepted, protections disappear, because you do not protect tools, you expose them. And that is exactly where the subpoenas come in. First came the Google subpoenas, broad, sweeping requests seeking account information, payment data, and communications tied to roughly 16 content creators, journalists, and online commentators. Some of those subpoenas landed quietly, some went to spam folders, some were ignored because they looked like phishing attempts, others triggered alarm bells immediately because they were unlike anything creators had seen before. This was not a request for comment, this was not a takedown notice. This was not a defamation claim. This was an attempt to map the financial and communication infrastructure of independent media, and the reaction was swift. Lawyers got involved, journalists spoke out, civil liberties advocates raised concerns, and suddenly the optics shifted. Because it is one thing to sue a director, it is another to aim at the internet itself. And when that pushback happened, something interesting occurred. Many of those Google subpoenas were quietly withdrawn, not fought, not defended, not litigated. They were simply abandoned, and that tells you everything you need to know. Because if the goal were truth, those subpoenas would have been pursued relentlessly. Instead, they were dropped because they were never meant to go to the end. They were meant to send a message. The message was clear. We are watching, and we can reach you. And for many creators, that was enough. Coverage slowed, tones softened, people backed away, not because they believed the narrative had changed, but because the cost of resisting suddenly became very real. Legal fees, stress, stress, exposure, time lost, income risk, and reputation damage, all without ever being accused of wrongdoing. And that is the chilling effect in action. But one person did not fold. Andy Signor of Popcorn Planet continued reporting, continued questioning, and continued refusing to hand over sources or concede the premise that journalism only exists if a court approves of the format. And that is why the focus narrowed. Because when you cannot scare everyone, you make an example of one. Andy was not sued as a defendant, he was targeted as a third party, and that distinction matters because third-party subpoenas are supposed to be used sparingly and only after exhausting other options, especially when press freedoms are involved. But instead of going through the actual defendants and proving coordination or payments, Blake Lively's legal team pursued the journalist himself, demanding communications, financial information, and materials that could reveal sources. The justification was that these materials went to the heart of her smear campaign theory. But what is critical is what happened next, because when Andy moved to quash the subpoena, arguing journalist privilege, First Amendment protections, and undue burden, the court did not simply disagree, it redefined him out of existence as a journalist.
The ruling from the federal magistrate judge in Florida did something deeply consequential. It did not say that journalism has limits. It said that Andy Signor was not really a journalist at all, because Popcorn Planet was described as little more than a YouTube channel, because he was a one-man operation, because he was the founder, editor, producer, and host, because he was not part of a traditional newsroom, and because he did not fit neatly into statutory categories written for a pre-digital era: newspapers, magazines, radio stations, television networks, wire services. Those definitions became gatekeeping tools, and once the gate is closed, everything on the other side becomes fair game. And that is the danger, because journalism is not a building, it is not a payroll, it is not a press badge. Journalism is an activity, gathering information, verifying it, contextualizing it, and publishing it in the public interest. And if that activity loses protection based on format, then the First Amendment becomes a privilege instead of a right. The broader implication here is not about one creator. It is about precedent, because if a court can declare that a YouTube-based investigative reporter is not entitled to journalist privilege, then every digital journalist is one ruling away from exposure. And once that door opens, celebrities, corporations, and powerful interests will not hesitate to use it, because why would they engage in public debate when they can engage in legal attrition? Why argue facts when you can drain resources and silence critics through process? And that is why this case matters beyond fandom, beyond celebrity drama, beyond Hollywood gossip. It goes to the core of whether the modern press is protected or conditional. There is also a profound irony at the heart of this story. Blake Lively's lawsuit is framed as a fight against abuse of power and retaliation, yet the tactics deployed against independent journalists mirror the very dynamics she claims to oppose, using superior resources to overwhelm smaller voices, redefining criticism as harassment, and reframing investigation as conspiracy. And when you zoom out, the picture becomes clear. This is not about correcting falsehoods. It is about reasserting control over narrative flows that have slipped beyond traditional boundaries. And the resistance to that control is exactly what independent media represents. Part 1 of this story is about recognition, recognizing that what looks like a narrow legal dispute is actually a warning sign, recognizing that the definition of journalist is being contested, not in theory, but in practice, and recognizing that the outcome will shape how freely creators can operate going forward, because once a line is drawn, it will be used again and again and again, and the question is not whether you agree with Andy Signor or like his content or support his conclusions. The question is whether you believe that the right to investigate, question, and publish should depend on approval from the very systems being scrutinized. Because if the answer is yes, then independent media is already over. And if the answer is no, then what happens next matters to everyone. Part 2 begins where the illusion of neutrality falls apart, because once you accept that the definition of journalist can be narrowed by convenience, everything else follows naturally. The next step is deciding whose voice matters, whose questions are legitimate, and whose scrutiny is labeled dangerous. And this is where the Hollywood ecosystem reveals its true mechanics, because power rarely announces itself as power. It disguises itself as procedure, as standards, as professionalism, as concern for safety and truth and reputation. But the moment you examine who benefits, those disguises dissolve. Hollywood has always functioned on controlled storytelling. Narratives are assets, careers are brands, and controversy is managed, not confronted. That is why public relations firms exist, not to tell the truth, but to shape perception, to redirect attention, to neutralize damage. And for decades, this system worked because information bottlenecks made it possible. Journalists needed access, studios controlled access, and stars rewarded compliance with exclusives and punished dissent with silence. But the digital era broke that arrangement permanently. Creators no longer needed invitations. They no longer needed premieres. They no longer needed phone calls returned. They only needed audiences. And once audiences realized that independent voices were often asking harder questions than legacy outlets, trust shifted. And when trust shifts, power panics. The Blake Lively lawsuit exists inside that panic, because while the legal filing presents itself as a response to alleged misconduct, it also functions as a vehicle for narrative reassertion, and the smear campaign theory is central to that vehicle, because it reframes criticism as orchestration and transforms journalists into actors within a plot, rather than observers of reality. And once journalists are cast as participants rather than reporters, they lose neutrality, they lose credibility, and eventually they lose protection. And that is exactly why the court ruling against Andy Signor is so significant. It does not just affect him, it validates the premise that independent media can be demoted from watchdog to suspect with the stroke of a pen. What makes this moment especially dangerous is how quietly it is happening. There are no dramatic censorship laws, no sweeping bans, no obvious gag orders. Instead, there are procedural maneuvers, subpoenas, discovery disputes, privilege arguments, technical definitions written decades ago and applied selectively today. And most people never notice those mechanisms until they are already in place, because they do not feel like censorship. They feel like paperwork. And that is how modern suppression operates, not through force, but through friction, not through bans, but through burdens, not through prison, but through process. The chilling effect is not hypothetical, it is already measurable. Creators are watching this case closely. They are consulting attorneys. They are changing language, removing videos, declining to cover the story, or adding disclaimers and hedging statements that dilute clarity. And that self-moderation is precisely the desired outcome, because it does not require enforcement. Once fear does the work for you. And the irony is that this fear does not arise from false reporting. It arises from reporting that refuses to align with preferred narratives. And when truth becomes inconvenient, procedure becomes weaponized. There is another layer here that deserves scrutiny: the role of legacy media silence while independent creators are targeted. Many mainstream outlets have barely touched the subpoena issue, barely examined the implications, barely defended the idea that journalism exists beyond their institutions. And that silence is not accidental, it is structural, because acknowledging that a YouTube journalist deserves the same protections as a newsroom reporter would require acknowledging that gatekeeping has failed, and that is an admission legacy media has no incentive to make. And so, the result is a quiet alignment where powerful celebrities challenge independent media and institutional media looks away, because the threat is not to them, at least not yet.
But history shows that lines drawn against outsiders never stay confined. Once the precedent exists, it expands, because the logic used to exclude Andy Signor can be used against freelancers, against Substack writers, against podcasters, against independent investigators, against anyone who does not fit neatly into legacy definitions, and eventually even traditional journalists feel the squeeze, because once protection is conditional, it can always be revoked. And that is why civil liberties organizations have repeatedly warned against narrow definitions of journalism, because the First Amendment was written to protect the act, not the actor, the function, not the format. The court ruling also exposes a dangerous misunderstanding of modern media economics. Being a one-person operation does not negate journalistic intent. Being monetized does not negate editorial independence. Using YouTube does not negate investigative purpose. And yet, these factors were cited as reasons to deny privilege. And that logic would disqualify many respected journalists working today: freelancers, investigative reporters, war correspondents, independent documentarians, many of whom operate outside institutional payrolls and rely on audience support. And if that model is stripped of protection, then the future of investigative journalism collapses, because institutions are shrinking, not growing, and independent work is filling the gap. What is particularly revealing is how the court emphasized structure over substance. Rather than examining whether Andy gathered information, verified sources, provided context, and reported on matters of public interest, the analysis focused on labels, on categories, on organizational charts, as if journalism were a corporate form rather than a democratic function. And that approach may be administratively convenient, but it is constitutionally dangerous, because rights do not belong to corporations, they belong to people. And when those rights are filtered through institutional criteria, they stop being rights and become licenses. Another critical aspect of this case is the selective nature of discovery. Blake Lively's legal team argues that Andy's communications are essential to proving a smear campaign, yet offers no concrete evidence that such a campaign exists beyond inference and speculation. And when pressed, the response is essentially that discovery will reveal the truth. But discovery is not supposed to be a fishing expedition, especially when journalistic rights are implicated, and courts have repeatedly held that heightened standards apply when journalists are targeted, because the harm of disclosure cannot be undone. Once sources are exposed, trust is broken permanently, and future sources disappear, and that damage extends far beyond a single case. Despite this, Andy has continued to report, to speak publicly, to defend his position, and to frame this issue not as a personal grievance, but as a systemic warning. And that choice matters, because many would have retreated quietly, settled quietly, complied quietly. But resistance forces the issue into the open, and once it's open, it can be examined, criticized, appealed, and challenged. And that is the only way precedents are overturned, because silence never corrects overreach, it only normalizes it. As this case moves forward, the stakes will only increase. Appeals may be filed, broader coalitions may form, other creators may intervene, amicus briefs may be submitted, and the legal question will eventually crystallize. Is journalism defined by medium or by mission? Is protection determined by platform or by practice? And the answer will shape the next decade of media freedom. And that is not hyperbole, it is structural reality, because law does not adapt automatically, it adapts through cases, and this case is now one of those defining moments. Part 2 ends with a sobering realization. The fight is no longer about one journalist must comply with one subpoena. It is about whether independent scrutiny can survive in a system increasingly hostile to uncontrolled narratives. Because when celebrities, corporations, and institutions can redefine critics as conspirators and reporters as participants, the public loses its ability to see clearly. And when that happens, power operates unchecked. And history shows that unchecked power never restrains itself voluntarily. It must be questioned, challenged, and exposed, and that is exactly what is under threat here. This case is no longer about one lawsuit or one YouTube creator. It is about whether power gets to decide who counts as a journalist and who does not, because the moment that line is drawn, independent media becomes optional, truth becomes negotiable, and silence becomes safer than scrutiny. And if that precedent stands, the next voice targeted will not be a surprise. It will be inevitable.